and roll. We are online. Good morning, everyone. We are about to begin our reading of Answer to Job at paragraph 575 of volume 11 of the collected works of C.G. Jung. We're still at the beginning stages, the second part of the book. Actually, in the book that has just Answer to Job, we're only on page 10, but because of the way page or paragraph numbering is done in the collected works, so that all translations and everything can be the same. There are paragraph numbers, and these are paragraph numbers in the collected works. This is volume 11, which is about psychology and religion. And so I hope you enjoy our program today. Jordan Hoggard is here to boost us along, keep us going, and maybe there'll be others. Good morning, Art. It's great to see you today. By the way, to all people outside the United States, we did have a time change last night. We are now on daylight saving time. So spring ahead and fall back. We went ahead 1 hour. So we are 1 hour later than we had been before. And so you'll need to check your iPhone to see what the time difference is where you are.
And thanks for the reminder, so I didn't go wandering around looking for the hour that I lost, wondering where it is.
Indeed. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about our rehearsal, and as everybody knows, we're doing a confluence in Helena, Montana in June, and there's a couple of things you want to know. I put the link up on the YouTube chat. One is that we have about 9 seats left and for the confluence, and we are planning to do a tour of Yellowstone after the confluence. So the confluence is the 10th to the 14th of June, and then we will be doing this Yellowstone tour, which will begin on the 14th and go to the 16th. And we'll have 2 vans that carry 7 people, and so there are 14 seats for the Yellowstone tour. And so if you have not registered for the Yellowstone tour, there is a Eventbrite sign up on the website. Please go to that Eventbrite sign up, and there will be two nights of bed and breakfast. We are reserving those on the assumption that a few people will want to do the Yellowstone tour with us, and it is going to be an epic time. I mean, we will have several professional artists with us in addition to me, and I'm hoping Jordan will join us on the Yellowstone tour. Anyway, there's a limitation on the number we can take. It'll be 14 people. We already know that there'll probably be Tim will probably take 2 seats, and my wife and I will take 2 seats. So that means there's 10 seats left for the Yellowstone tour. It will be an additional cost of between $470 and $630. If we only get 8 people to go with us, then it's going to be more like $630. But if we get all 14 seats filled, it'll be $470 for the Yellowstone tour. That includes 2 nights stay over and local knowledge, because obviously Tim Holmes has been through Yellowstone many times in his lifetime. And there will be other locals with us. So I hope you'll join us, and it'll be an exciting, fun time. And
thanks for letting me know about the Eventbrite, because when I signed up originally a couple months ago and paid the additional trips and options weren't set up yet. So
right.
I'm glad that Eventbrite's that's a good program to set.
And there are a couple of other things on the Eventbrite website or issue or page, let's say. We will be before the beginning of the confluence, early on Friday, the June 10th. We will be going to the Continental Divide to acquire sacred water from east and west of the United States. We're at the Continental Divide, so we'll be symbolically receiving this water at a spring that serves both sides. And after we acquire the water, we are going to go up into the mountains where there are what they call dolmens in the Rockies. Nobody knows how these things were formed, but some of them are 53 feet high, and they look like stones out of Stonehenge. And so it's going to be quite a remarkable visit for that. We'll be doing that in the morning of Friday. It's not an official part of the confluence, but it is a part. And then in the afternoon of the 10th, we will be having an exhibit of art by several of the confluence participants. And yeah, that even includes me. I guess I'm going to do my best to have some of my calligraphy work there by then. I keep giving it away, so I don't know what I'm going to have there, but we have some remarkable pieces there. And I'll just share with you
It's funny that you don't know if you have any, because I remember a gallery approaching me in 1997 to show, will you do an oil and water show? And I'm like, I'm out of paintings. What do you mean? There have been too many birthdays since the last time we've talked.
Yeah. Okay, so let's see. I'm just looking at my photos from the weekend so that I can share them. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and just show a few of the images from the weekend. We were in Carmel, California, and there's Tim on the right, Tim Holmes, Sherry Leveler, and John Jackson, retired psychiatrist, and Sherry is a professional artist. Tim is the director of our play that we're going to perform, and John and Sherry are 2 of the players. I'm the 3rd one. And so there, I got into the picture too. And right behind my head here, that's Pebble Beach, where the Pebble Beach golf course is. Okay, now I'm not going to show all these pictures because it will just make you dizzy, but I'll just give you a sense of the place here. This is the cabin that Tim's family has in Carmel, and it's quite a wonderful place. The place is filled with Tim Holmes art, and so it's very exciting in that way. While we were there, I made Skip's famous curry. I'm thinking about doing this for the confluence, but I take 10 vegetables plus pineapples and apples and cut them up. This is the ones you need. You cut them all up, and then you put curry powder in it, and then boil it for about 5 hours, and you get curry. Let's see.
Nice.
A couple more. There are a lot of interesting homes in Carmel, so this is one of them, just for interest's sake.
Carmel's a wonderful architectural library.
Right, and here's one of Tim's paintings. I mean, these paintings are just luminescent when you see them in real life. I'm sorry I didn't take it very well. Here's another one. It's very exciting. Obviously, there's Pebble Beach there in the distance, and here's another. This is a conjunctio, and I asked him if he knew it was a conjunctio when he did it, but he did. He said no. There's a couple more. As you can see, it's just a lovely cabin inside. It's quite large, also, and here. Are you still seeing pictures, John?
No,
or Jordan? Okay.
It's back to us.
All right. So very quickly now, Tim and I on Monday had one day together going back from Carmel to San Jose, and we were going to go to the San Jose Museum, and I was really excited because I said, wow, I've never gotten to go to a museum with a professional artist. This is going to be amazing. But before we did that, here's Tim with the jellyfish at the Monterey Marina. There's a beautiful aquarium at Monterey Bay, right on Cannery Row, famous Cannery Row referred to by John Steinbeck. And all these are living creatures. This is Tim's silhouette here. I thought this was a very iconic picture that I caught.
Nice.
Okay, I'm just going to whip through these. But then on the way to San Jose, San Jose, Tim says, well, 35 years ago, I went to the Stanford campus and saw the Rodin exhibit. There's a Rodin sculpture garden there, and he was talking about one of the pieces, which is Walking Man. And so we get to San Jose and the museum's closed. So I said, Tim, we're 10 miles south of Stanford. Let's go to the campus and see the Rodin Museum. And so we did. And so here we are in the sculpture garden. And I'm not going to give you the full spiel that Tim gave me, but it's just a remarkable place. And this is the Gates of Hell, the famous Gates of Hell of Auguste Rodin. There are only 5 examples of this in the world. I had seen one at the Museum of Western Art in Ueno, Tokyo, when I was a senior in high school. And this pose was put on by one of my classmates when we were 16 years old. And so I decided to replicate the pose.
Got to hold them all back.
Yeah. And,
I saw it in 1989 at Meudon. And
so the Gates of Hell have examples of many of Rodin's most famous pieces. And and so I'm just going to flip through them. This is Walking Man, and Tim was telling me about the significance of this piece, and to him, which was that he didn't like it, and he was avoiding it when he visited 35 years ago. But then as he walked past it, it just grabbed him 35 years ago. And so he went back and looked at it and looked at all these like holes in the body and things that are not real by human standards. And it became his favorite work there. And so this is one of the burgers of Calais in without unrobed. And Rodin did all of his sculptures, many of his sculptures robed, but he would fully do the sculpture underneath first so that everything hung right. And so these are heads from the burgers of Calais. Okay. All right. That's enough of the sidelight. Oh, I guess I was trying to get a sense of how big it was compared to Tim. He says it's 26 feet high. Oh, and then by coincidence, we went to the Apple store at Apple headquarters, and we're on the roof at the Apple store and looking at the headquarters of Apple at Cupertino. So that was another extra that we got. It was
curious. It's curious too. And I wrote down the burgers of Calais unclothed first, simply because people at that time stood differently than the Greeks and the Romans, and he wanted to make sure that he got the posture correct. Because if you just did it like the Greeks or the Romans, well, they're standing differently, and then with clothes it would look absurd.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So moving on to Answer to Job. Thank you for the digression, everyone. But I thought we'd give you a sense of the process that we're going through to prepare for the confluence, which is indeed, as Kathy Kerr says here on the YouTube chat, it's going to be epic. And
that's good four letter.
Right. And so we are on paragraph 575. I will read the paragraph and then we'll comment on it. And this is part 2 of Answer to Job. Since the omniscient looks into all hearts and Yahweh's eyes run to and fro through the whole earth, it were better for the interlocutor of the 89th Psalm not to wax too conscious of his slight moral superiority over the more unconscious God. Better to keep it dark, for Yahweh is no friend of critical thoughts, which in any way diminish the tribute of the recognition he demands. Loudly as his power resounds through the universe, the basis of its existence is correspondingly slender, for it needs conscious reflection in order to exist in reality. Existence is only real when it is conscious to somebody. That is why the Creator needs conscious man, even though from sheer unconsciousness, he would like to prevent him from becoming conscious. And that is also why Yahweh needs the acclamation of a small group of people. One can imagine what would happen if this assembly suddenly decided to stop the applause. There would be a state of high excitation with outbursts of blind, destructive rage. Then a withdrawal into hellish loneliness and the torture of non-existence, followed by a gradual reawakening of an unutterable longing for something that would make him conscious of himself. It is probably for this reason that all pristine things, even man before he becomes the canal, have a touching magical beauty, for in its nascent state, each thing after its kind is the most precious, the most desirable, the tenderest thing in the world, being a reflection of the infinite love and goodness of the Creator. Okay, there's a lot in this paragraph. Do you want to talk about it, Jordan, a little bit?
Yeah, there is quite a lot of this paragraph, and it to me, the 2 points that stand out is the Old Testament God as a 4-year-old throwing tantrums when not paid attention to, which is kind of pre-evolution and New Testament stories. But then the where it goes, yeah, in terms of the outbursts of blind, destructive rage. But there's also then the existence is only real when it is conscious to somebody, which then that starts to dial into all philosophies and seminars in cognition, and I think therefore I am, or I feel therefore I live, etc., etc. But it's interesting how this one paragraph starts okay, look at God as a tantrum throwing 4-year-old, not immoral, but amoral, because completely unconscious. And that's from a anthropomorphic psychological standpoint, selfish perspective, which is childish instead of childlike. But then the wisdom of consciousness being required for existence to make something quote unquote real. And so it's interesting how much cycles around in here, just from a creation story perspective, and not to demean 4-year-olds for throwing tantrums, but or God in the same right. But at the same time, there is a piece of, I would say, raw data of the divine here, rather than the polished divinity that is more known as Eros.
Right. Okay, I was just looking for the 89th Psalm here to see what all it says. It's pretty long, but I think it's more important that we go through this paragraph in more detail. So, first of all, what is said in the very first phrase, since the omniscient looks into all hearts. Okay, what Jung is referring to here is that God is within us. There's no omniscient guy up there in the sky pulling strings. Okay, it's within us. Each of us has a part of that. And so since God is omniscient, it means that God can see all things as God is looking at all of us. So this relates to the religious function that comes in every human being, regardless of religion. And Yahweh's eyes run to and fro through the earth. So in that sense, God is looking back and forth because he's at one moment looking through my eyes, and next moment through your eyes, and next moment through Jordan's eyes, and it's making us conscious of more and more things. So probably most Americans didn't think much about Ukraine before 2 weeks ago, but now all of our eyes are pointing toward Ukraine, and we don't know what God will hold for us for the future, what our fate is, but we know that the collective unconscious is cooking up to do something. We're only seeing the beginning of the war. We're not seeing the denouement of the war, and so it's rather sobering to realize that we're actually potentially on the cusp of World War III, and if our leaders are not very judicious in their wisdom, we're going to end up in World War III. And we're seeing that President Putin is also with an element of God, but the evil side. And as Jung is telling us in this answer to Job, better to keep it dark, for Yahweh is no friend of critical thoughts, which in any way diminish the tribute of recognition he demands. And so we see the Putin part of God trying to shut up dissent and prevent dissent around his country. And as we see it now, mankind as a whole has a slight moral superiority over the more unconscious God. So Putin is more unconscious. He doesn't really consider things carefully from his personal perch. And, there's a reality that in the UN, 187 countries voted against him and only 5 voted with him. And those 5 are the pariahs typically of the earth. And so God as the collective unconscious is coming into consciousness, and it's a very slow process. As Dr. Jung observed when he stood on the side of Mount Elgon and observed the rivers of herds of different species running before him, he realized that it had taken hundreds of millions of years of evolution for the herds to get to the state they were on the day he was looking. And during all of that time, there was no consciousness per se to observe them, except maybe in the last 4 million years as humans evolved, they could serve them and make a reference to God about them. But before that, there was just total unconsciousness. It was just devouring and begetting on the earth, and nothing more. And so
I would contribute also to in regards to Yahweh's eyes, quote unquote, run to and fro through the whole earth, end quote. I would indicate also that Yahweh's eyes, God's eyes, would be eyes of living fire. And in that, the run to and fro through the whole earth is that living earth that's volcanic activity, magma. And the don't wax too conscious, like our lands, the things that we know, when the magma erupts and then is called lava, it hits the atmosphere and the water and cools, or the ocean and the water and cools. But either way, it's making new lands. So there is a quality there of how even the psyche, the nourishing quality of living earth from the psyche, from the creative wellspring, upheaves to nourish us even in that. So not even just, through each of us and the animals, also the earth, the living portion of the Gaia of the living portion of the earth as well, would simply be the path of the process between what's magma underground and lava that then cools to make new lands, would make basically a metaphor for new wisdom, new consciousness coming into being there also. So that works just parallel with, the human condition.
Right. So going on to the next sentence then. Loudly as his power resounds through the universe, the basis of its existence is correspondingly slender, for it needs conscious reflections in order to exist in reality. Existence is only real when it is conscious to somebody. Okay, so if we apply this to Putin, he's made a very loud sound, so we're all conscious of him. now, or the part of Yahweh that is within him. We're conscious of him, and he needs reflection in order to exist. So right now he's got everybody looking at him. It's like it's like a bully who goes around to make people angry at him so that he knows he exists, type of thing. And he's only real when he's conscious to somebody. But his problem is that he's a one-man show, actually. And if we punch a hole in his balloon, we find that he's just the Wizard of Oz standing behind the curtain. And if others in his inner circle realize how weak he really is as a human being, then his current magic of controlling this abysmal force attacking Ukraine will fall away, and he'll collapse. And
what's interesting about that too is that there have been multiple accounts of other world leaders who say that everyone pretty much knows that Putin really sequestered. During the pandemic, it with very, very serious, rigorous rules, and to his own benefit, as he thought that would be. But other world leaders have made very, very similar statements that when they've spoken with him now, 2+ years later, they say, I was addressing a completely different man. And so there's that process of being sequestered for a couple of years too, that I think has contributed to an isolationism that in that sense becomes this, the 4-year-old Old Testament Yahweh, God character lashing out. Tribute has not been paid. The USSR was, someone stole their toys, and Ukraine was one of them. And so now the tantrum is coming back to make USSR instead of just Russia. And so there's a combination of I think that, again, childish versus childlike. And it's amazing here how much Vladimir Zelensky comes across as the wise parent. And,
yeah,
and he may be smaller, but even the joke memes of, Russian tank slightly used, $2.6 million on eBay. It's like, because they stole it, they took it, they captured it. And so that the fact that the Ukrainians are, when Zelensky said, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. He could have loaded up planes with money and left, and he didn't. So, yeah. Hey, Joel.
Hi, Joel. Nice to see you. Anders says on the YouTube channel, do you mean that humanity today is collectively at a higher stage of development than Putin? That's an interesting idea. Well, I wouldn't know about humanity in its entirety, but yeah, it does relate to this sentence that Jung put in: better to keep it dark, for Yahweh is no friend of critical thoughts, which in any way diminish the tribute of recognition he demands. So that part of Yahweh that's manifesting from Putin obviously demands tribute and recognition, and he's no friend of critical thoughts. And so he has this great power, which is sort of ephemeral. It only exists if we believe it exists. And the reality is he is only one man. And so how many people around him believe that it exists or know that it exists. It's an open question. It's like a soap bubble, and albeit a big soap bubble, but if you put a pin in it, it's going to pop.
And also, I think that Putin is a high-level black belt, so you get a discipline of the ritual of he has gone through hardship, he has gone through passage, he has gone through transformation, but that's a polished gem in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And the January 6th gig over here, there's the raw data. That's the raw ore of the same conceptual thing, but that just goes out and shoots things in the forest with a can of beer. I mean, and what's interesting about those two things, it's interesting how much that has quieted down now that Daddy Putin, so to speak, has stepped up, because they're no match. And it confuses them because they're in a similar place of a lack of development. Putin just has more polish on it. But the problem is there's too much polish on the turd, so to speak.
Okay, so he says, Jung is saying in this paragraph, existence is only real when it is conscious to somebody. Well, Putin said, what's the point of having a world if there's no Russia? Okay, so that's a little bit sideways, because if you don't have a world, then nobody's conscious of it anyway. And so
and that's the inflation.
The point of having a world is so that people can be conscious of Russia. And if you destroy the world, nobody's going to be conscious of Russia. So,
and that's his psychological inflation too, equating his self with the whole country itself, and that consciousness piece, whereas if he is the only voice of that thing which is now gone, it's not the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, USSR, anymore, it's Russia. And that conglomerate would be like the counterpart to the United States, and making it say carve off California and Texas or something. And then that is now, America.
Well, Anders has made a comment here, but it's really about the Ukraine war and not about this paragraph. So for the moment, I'm going to focus on the paragraph, and then we'll come back to the war issues in a minute. But I'm trying to take this sentence by sentence and showing how it applies to what's happening to us today. And so he says, and that is also why Yahweh needs the acclamation of a small group of people. So Putin needs his oligarchs to acclaim him and say he's wonderful. And so he's acting as Yahweh in this case, but he doesn't have a very large following. I don't know how many oligarchs there are out of Russia, 20 or 30, I suppose. And will they still acclaim him if they lose all their toys, which it seems they're in the process of doing.
Mm-hmm. Yachts being confiscated, etc.
Yeah. And he says, one can imagine what would happen if this assembly suddenly decided to stop applause. There would be a state of high excitation with outbursts of blind, destructive rage, when a withdrawal into hellish loneliness and the torture of non-existence, followed by a gradual reawakening of an unutterable longing for something which would make him conscious of himself. And so this is why Putin has to be dealt with very carefully, because he's obviously potentially in this blind destructive rage state. He could get into that very easily. And if he does that, he's going to destroy not only a few cities in Ukraine, he may destroy the whole world. Because as we've said numerous times, the number differs, but between 23 and 100 nuclear weapons detonating in the atmosphere kills all life on Earth. And, over a period of time, you don't have to be in the blast to have it kill you later on within a year or two. And so,
right here, when you said the gradual reawakening of an unutterable longing. So now we also have the biblical concepts all rushing in of ineffable name, unutterable longing, these things that basically transcend consciousness that are actually becoming conscious.
Yeah. And so then in the next sentence, it is probably for this reason that all pristine things, even man, before he becomes the canal, I don't know what canal means. So
I think the conduit, in a way, like a,
yeah.
Let me look that up.
Maybe it's like a canal.
That's good.
Check it out if you would. Have a touching, magical beauty, for in its nascent state, each thing after its kind is the most precious, the most desirable, the tenderest thing in the world, being a reflection of the infinite love and goodness of the Creator. And so, this is basically what Putin has said. What's the point of having a world if there's no Russia in it?
That's what's interesting here is even man, before he becomes the canal, that's the common people, the masses. So from a Shakespearean perspective, the plebeians, American slang, oh, you're a plebe. I mean, it's a derogatory term, meaning just common people and the masses.
Okay, so Steve Jones says, I think Putin, hello, Kushbu, by the way. Good morning, good evening to you. We've changed our times, Kushbu, in case you hadn't noticed. We're 1 hour later than usual, and that will remain through the summer at least. But anyway, Steve Jones says, I think Putin is trying to bait us, stay the course, and keep sanctions on indefinitely until Russian people seek to change, strengthen existing NATO countries in the Russian geographic area. I'm not quite sure what your point is there, Steve, but I do concur that he's trying to bait us, and he's sort of testing the limits of his power. And so he might try to test his limits by using chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons. And I think that most people with any common sense consider that a red line that cannot be passed. And
in that regard, it wasn't lost on me that I was in the grocery store when the mask mandate here was lifted. The mayor, just in a council meeting, took her mask off and said, okay, it's time. And, I get home and immediately then there's this. So, the scale of, my small existence was mask, no mask. But Putin taking off the mask, so to speak, was, okay, time to get back to the party. Here comes some more stuff, instead of being sequestered, so to speak, from a militaristic standpoint. It seems a lot has happened in the vessel the last couple of years with him being alone, and that pressure release valve wasn't tapped often enough, I think, during that time. And so now there's this, it's not so gradual, this reawakening of this unutterable longing, in this case for war.
Yeah, what I would say about masks is to this day, Japanese people still
Mhm.
wear masks whenever they are sick. They will wear a mask, not to protect themselves, but to protect others.
Right.
And
And that's
they,
cultural respect.
yeah, and that's right. And they have done that at least since the Spanish flu pandemic,
Yeah.
right?
And turn of the
And
20th century,
right,
right?
and there are pictures of them doing that. And I know in my case, in the case of my family, because it's my wife who's nearly 70, my mother-in-law who's 91, I expect that we'll be wearing our masks in public places, judiciously, for probably for the rest of our lives. In other words, if we go to the grocery store or someplace where the unwashed public is, we'll probably wear a mask to protect ourselves. But if we go to a restaurant and we sit down and we're being waited on, we'll probably take them off. And in fact, we do that at our local club where we go to dinner sometimes, when we come in wearing our masks, but once we sit down and it's just us and one waiter, I guess we can assume at this point that the waiters in the club have been inoculated, so that we're pretty safe in that environment. But in the drugstore or the food store or going into a movie theater, we would wear them and then take them off after we're seated and after the audience is seated, so that we know they're not things flying around type thing.
Well, and interesting to me structurally, just from a laminar flow, air flow, liquid flow, breath flow. When you sit down to a table, your head is typically at eye level or looking down. And you're also near, literally, half the distance from a standing perspective down to the ground.
Mhm.
So airborne, not that airborne things don't go up, because you also have ventilation, in rooms like that will lift things. But there's a different, it's almost like a plane flying low and a plane flying high. There's still planes in the air. There's still things in the air that are toxic and healthy, etc. But when you sit down, it's not that, oh, okay, now I'm safe. I mean, there's an invisibility to the danger. In a sense, the unutterable longing, the unseeable thing. There's a lot of divinity in these tiny viral things that I think metaphorically can be utilized, that in a sense are so big or so small that you can't see them.
So Anders says, okay, humanity in general may not be more developed than Putin, but what Putin is doing might indirectly help humanity as a whole to develop into a higher level. And I concur with that. I mean, I don't think it's a good idea to have a war to increase human consciousness, but surely we are all very conscious of Putin now, and we recognize the threats that maybe we thought fell away. Because when I was active in the Marine Corps, and mind you, I've been retired for 35 years, but when I was active in the Marine Corps, what was the threat that we were prepared for, aside from Asia, which obviously the Marines had a big role in Vietnam and so on. But the 2nd Marine Division has always been, and its headquarters is at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, but its role has always been, in the event of an attack from Russia, to defend the left flank of NATO, which meant Norway, Finland, Scandinavia, and the Baltic countries. And so So we always thought when I was a reservist also, the reserves would go anywhere but there too. We always thought that we would be fighting in Norway and maybe Finland if the Russians were to decide to attack, but we thought they would be attacking into Germany. Okay. And that was before the Iron Curtain fell down and so on. So now Russia is attacking, but at least it's in Ukraine and not in Western Europe. The role of the American military in Germany is mainly to die. Okay, the idea is that if we have a bunch of troops in NATO, or especially in Germany, we had a lot of them in the late 70s and 80s, that many of them would get killed in an initial attack from the Russians, and the Russians could indeed force through tank warfare their way all the way through to Madrid in a couple of days. Well, we see that isn't really a reality now. That was a hyper fear, but
well, and tactically too, what's interesting is juvenile, because you get these long, highly visible linear tank. I mean, that's just asking for ambush. And
oh yeah,
people say, the right foot laid down on Ukraine, the left foot's going to move to Moldavia. Well, the right foot hadn't really not stepped on stickers yet. I mean, the right foot came in, I think, with a hubris, and the Ukrainian people are not of hubris. They're of a very evolved, more thrival than survival. I mean, I still think my favorite moment in this whole thing, if it's a little dubious to have a favorite moment in war, pre-war, but was the grandmother standing up to a Russian soldier and telling him, you should put a handful of sunflower seeds in your pocket, so when you die here, something beautiful replaces you. And that
was good. I really appreciated that one.
Yeah, and that to me expresses, I mean, that's not just someone who has nothing to lose. I mean, hi, I'm really old, so a life sentence, means less and less every day. I mean, kind of thing. That's someone who's had wits her whole life. Yeah. And that's simply expressive of the Ukrainian, not just solidarity, but the natural engagement of, they may have plenty of fear, but they're not afraid. And I think that lack of anxiety is expressive of a very evolved culture that will come out at the times they need to, and then, go back to being a drugstore clerk, but they'll step out and become a hero. And then, no, well, I have to go mind the war's over. I need to go take care of the cash register. So people want some things on aisle 6, I mean, and that's very, to me, evolved. There's a very manual transmission of an engine of people then turning on the super sport, the super sport version.
Yeah. So the point was that if American troops are killed, that will get America angry enough to be in the war. And keep in mind that the war in Europe in World War II went on for 2.5 years almost before America entered the war. The same is true of World War I. The American troops barely got into Europe in 1917. The war started in 1914, but America didn't get into the war for a couple of years that time. And again, in World War II, we didn't get into the war until American troops started to lose their lives. And so then that shows that we have a dog in the fight. I think that we have now, over a century's time, through our national war colleges and our naval war college, Army war college, all those things, we have properly learned and assessed these psychological issues. Plus, we've gained a lot of psychological knowledge. We've done exchanges with armies all over the world, including the Ukrainians and the Russians. I think we've had Russians that have gone to our military colleges. But the point is that unless there's a commitment to that, I mean, Russia has always been the threat. And we feel that threat. We have always felt that threat as long as I know, because I retired in 1991. I retired in 91, right at the end of Gulf War I. And so we certainly have known all along that something like this could happen. But I think some civilians have gotten lazy in their thinking. I mean, to the extent that we have American red state people who think it's wonderful what Putin is doing. Good grief, those people have no clue what it was really like back then in the post-war years and so on.
Mm-hmm. And the red states and such with basically, I'll call it the January 6th, the insurrection crowd, so to speak. I've seen plenty of cartoons in the last week or so of, you take one of them and someone goes, "Oh, here's your free plane ticket. Keep the gun. We're gonna go ahead and put your money where your mouth is. Let's take you over to there to fight." And there's this they retreat in a way, and now it's not so my rights and my ability to step out. And I find that what's interesting there is with Ukraine and Russia, I know when I was a kid, I thought, size versus size. There's the United States on the map, and then there's Russia or USSR at that point on the map.
Right.
And, get X equals X, 1-to-1. But then you start to realize over time how small Russia's economy actually is.
Yeah.
And so there's this lifeblood of the currency, not just of value, but actually of money.
Yeah.
And you start to see things like then Ukraine becomes very, very dense. It may be smaller, but the old adage of it's not the size of the dog in the fight, it's the size of the fight in the dog. And
absolutely,
you pick on the wrong thing, and it may be a tiny little thing, but it's got gnashing teeth, and it can do some serious damage if you engage. And
right.
I think that's what we're seeing, where the size of the fight in the dog in Ukraine is just a natural part of their life, and they get it because
and I think Putin forgot that both Napoleon's invasion of Russia in the early 19th century and the Nazi invasion of Russia during World War II were both fought through Ukraine, and they were both defeated in Ukraine. And so
and anything that entered in the winter was annihilated, not just defeated.
Absolutely. And so now Putin followed the dictum that you shouldn't fight a winter battle, right? And so he waited until after the Olympics and so on. But now are the mud times, okay? And so definitely his troops are going to get bogged down in the mud, and the more they destroy things in Ukraine, the harder it's going to be. And I actually had an experience in the reserves where it was early spring, and we were doing an exercise across the field, and all of a sudden one of my 6x trucks got sunk in the mud, and it was hell. It took us best part of a day to get it out. And I remember I was just sort of a inexperienced captain when I became company commander of the unit in Rochester, New York. And so when that happened, and my truck dug itself down to its bed, so its wheels had no traction whatsoever, and it was just sitting on its bed. And I was there giving orders, do this. And my predecessor gave me a really valuable lesson on that occasion. And he was a major at the time. And he says, "Hey, Skip, come on over here." And I said, "Oh, yes, sir. What do you want?" And he says, "Get in the Jeep." I said, "Aye, aye, sir." And he said, "Then when I'm in the Jeep," he says, "let them do it, because this is training. And if they can't do it themselves, they won't be able to do it in battle. So let them experience getting the truck out themselves." And that was a valuable experience for me.
Well, the overarching perspective, looking at that also, the unseen, omitted piece there is that you also are now a sitting duck. And so as one of the experiences is, I don't want that to happen again. Well, the whole don't, and Lao Tzu or Sun Tzu, never interrupt your enemy while they're making a mistake. I mean, when you see the other forces start to move into that mud field, it's like, hold, let's just wait. But they're advancing, and not for long, because they're going to sink, and then it's just ducks in a barrel or fish in a barrel. And it's interesting there that they have to do it themselves to be able to do it when they're under stress, and will forget everything you ever taught them. They have to have themselves experientially. So
and it's right now has to be done right now. And oh, by the way, you reservists, you're not going home until this truck is out of the ditch, right?
Right.
And so you mentioned the young Russian who was confronted by the grandmother. I mean, for him, he doesn't know nothing, and to have her confront him that way must have been shattering, actually.
Well, yeah, because he's young and she's the mom, so she's in charge. She is naturally, innately going to be respected, regardless of who she is,
right?
Because of the stature of her position of she's mom, or in the worst case, she's mother, which was be a little more stern.
Right. So anyway, what I'm trying to do through this discussion and through this past paragraph is to get everyone to see that how prescient Carl Jung was, and how clearly he understood man's behavior, and how Yahweh, which is an uncontrolled collective unconscious, let's say, or a collective unconscious that's gone the wrong way, mankind has to develop more consciousness of these things. And so it's one thing to talk about this in terms of Yahweh, but it's quite another when we talk about this is a real thing that's happening to us right now, and we better wake up, type thing. And I believe that in the fullness of time, when the history of this time is written, that we'll be very thankful that we have a very wise man in the presidency, and not a man who is inexperienced, which is what Trump was. I mean, Trump was a Putin type who always got his way because he would throw a tantrum and he had all the money. But
and that's a very astute point, because also when you get someone like T-rump, as I call him, rather than Trump, capitalize the R for the rump. It's the kind of thing where it's basically the other old adage of, if you take things personally and you are moved by words, you are so easily able to be manipulated, because it's a diet form of hubris, just easy to taunt, easy to trick, easy to fool. I mean, and I hate, pardon quoting, the movie, the 300, from the Spartans and Thermopylae, but that was another kind of piece there, where you get 300 people in the hot gates, the Battle of Thermopylae, against millions of Persians, and it was a war machine, except they backed up to their most dense point, where the only thing you can get is the tip of the spear.
Yeah.
And that strategic piece is more evolved. It goes back to this paragraph, even man before he becomes the canal, the common people, having a touching, magical beauty. It freaked the Persians out that the Spartans were doing their hair the day before. They were becoming presentable to death, rather than preparing by being afraid. Their whole life was military. Their whole life was living. And so they were going to live fully. And in that day, eat hearty, boys, because tomorrow we dine in hell, I think Leonidas said.
Right.
And I think that's what we get a whole thing with the Ukraine, but I personally don't want to see a martyrdom occur, where it's a past tense. I'd like to see this one turn, and people like Zelensky be part of this world, because he has a strong, artful, magical, evolved personality. I mean, this is someone who is an actor. He played the piano for 5 minutes in a very, very different way than most people play the piano. So there's a humor in him that I think that comes from the kind of humor that's developed in warriors and warrioresses, and that comes from being, quote unquote, in the shit. You've gone through your passages, of which he certainly has.
Right. And, all of us have had, one of the points here is that all of us have been in Putin's position, right? Mm-hmm. Because what's Putin's seeing? He saw that in his career, after the fall of the Iron Curtain, quite a number of countries that were within the Russian sphere have joined NATO. Okay, it's quite a number. It's obviously all the Baltic states, plus Hungary, Romania, and Poland. All these countries had been in the Russian sphere of influence during the Iron Curtain times. But when the Iron Curtain fell, all of those countries joined NATO because they wanted to be protected from the immaturity of certain people in Russia. Okay, that isn't to say that all people in Russia are immature, because as we saw in the movie 13 Days, of course, there are mature people in Russia who know what's going on. Maybe all the people don't know what's going on, but there are senior level people who know what's going on and know that it's wrong, and also know that it's unwinnable. And even the leading admiral of the Japanese Navy knew going into Pearl Harbor that once he stuck a finger into the eye of America by Pearl Harbor, that he would awaken a sleeping giant, and that sleeping giant would ultimately win. And obviously many of the people under Putin know that this is an unwinnable war for Putin. and always was. Whether or not there was a Zelensky, I mean, it's great that Zelensky is there, but whether or not there is a Zelensky, he put a finger in the eye of America and the West. You know, all the West is not only America, all of NATO, and so he did what maybe we couldn't do after the fall of the wall, because we, you know, some people got lazy in our thinking and so on. But what happened as soon as he punched his finger in our eye, consciousness comes very quickly, and he solidified NATO. And because none of those countries want to be dominated by the likes of Vladimir Putin. And so,
well, you know, it's been, I collected stamps when I started very, very young. And instead of, you know, great words like philately and numismatic, you know, stamps and coins, what I found most interesting was not so much the history lesson, but the living history lesson of seeing the comings and goings of countries, even only by name change. And I remember being so excited that I had these 5 mint stamps from White Russia, like 1917, 1920, also known as Belarus, or Belarusia. But what's interesting is those 5 stamps came and went. White Russia came and went. And that Belarus piece, it's still there. I mean, the dirt didn't go anywhere. The people didn't go anywhere.
Yeah.
But the naming there and the infrastructure, I mean, to the point of getting to a postage stamp, you have a government established. You know, the first thing someone who takes over, the first thing they think about is not, oh, what stamps are we going to make? You know, that's not a real strategic decision that's included in the, you know, invasion or the conquest or the peacekeeping, etc. But I just remember, wow, those 5 stamps, just the fact that they exist, tell a whole process of a whole story. And in that sense, we're kind of in that place right now where the details really matter.
Yeah. Okay, so let's read another paragraph or 2 if we can get through them. We'll see. I will read, and then we'll come back and see what we want to talk about. Okay. So we're on 576. In view of the undoubted frightfulness of divine wrath, and in an age when men still knew what they were talking about when they said fear God, it was only to be expected that man's slightest superiority should have remained unconscious. Slight superiority should have remained unconscious. The powerful personality of Yahweh, who, in addition to everything else, lacked all biological antecedents, his original relationship with the Elohim had long since been sunk in oblivion, had raised him above all the noumena of the Gentiles, and had immunized him against their influence that for several centuries had been undermining the authority of the pagan gods. It was precisely the details of their mythological biography that had become their nemesis. For with his growing capacity for judgment, man had found these stories more and more incomprehensible and indecent. Yahweh, however, had no origin and no past except his creation of the world, with which all history began, and his relation to that part of mankind whose forefather Adam had fashioned in his own image as the anthropos, the original man, by what appears to have been a special act of creation. Just a minute. One can only suppose that the other human beings who must also have existed at that time had been formed previously on the divine potter's wheel, along with the various kinds of beasts and cattle. Those human beings, namely from whom Cain and Seth chose their wives. If one does not approve of this conjecture, then the only other possibility that remains is the far more scandalous one, that they incestuously married their sisters, for whom there is no evidence in the text, as was still surmised by the philosopher Karl Lamprecht at the end of the 19th century. Okay, so Jordan. I think one issue is man's slight superiority could have remained unconscious. So the point is that there is a slight superiority in some humans who are more mature than other humans. And we saw this on January 6th. We're seeing it now where we can, there may be great pain and many deaths because God works in mysterious ways. But we can see simply by history and simply looking at demographics today and so on, that there's no chance that Russia can win. Okay, Putin is done. Nobody's going to believe him ever again in the world. We simply won't. And so he may be in power somehow, but his threat to the world, he's pulled it out, and now we see him for what he is. Now we're conscious of what and who he is. And in the same way, we're conscious of the immaturity of the people who attacked the Capitol on January 1st and how they got sucked into a collective movement by, again, a person who is and always was immature and was known to be that way by the other mature elements of our society. So I remember a cover on Newsweek, where Trump was thinking about, wow, why don't we use the atomic bomb? Okay, well, at that point, he had not been educated on that at all. Any junior officer in the U.S. military, all the way up, knows why we don't use nuclear weapons, okay, and why it would be an absolutely last resort. Everybody in the military, every officer in the military knows that nuclear war cannot happen. And if it does, then we're all going to have to bend over and kiss it goodbye. but Trump, who never had that experience, who was a man with a bone spur, never got trained and got to understand that. And so he thought he could pull these kinds of stunts and win, and he cannot. I mean, it was always obvious from the day it happened that the military would not go for Trump, number one, okay, and also that anybody with any maturity wouldn't go. And so we see guys in the January 6th event who were clueless about what was happening and what they were trying to do and what would be achieved. And they're going to continue to see the consequences of what they did for another 10 years, probably, because it'll probably take that long for the consequences to work through the courts. But ultimately, there's going to be a huge price to be paid, and that will raise a lot of consciousness, and people will realize that they have destroyed their lives. I mean, whether they go ahead.
And so you just reminded me of my second favorite, other than sunflower seed cartoon, and that's recent study shows not a single case of bone spurs has occurred in Ukraine. It's like,
Yeah. And
it's like we don't even have that kind of person. I mean, it's like it's
yeah. So Jung says, in an age when men still knew what
Right.
they were talking about when they said fear God, it was only to be expected that man's slight superiority should have remained unconscious. Okay, so the point is that we've talked ourselves in the last 500 years since the scientific method emerged. We've talked ourselves out of quote unquote a belief in God. Okay, most people I know, will go to church for community reasons or to build up their law practice or what have you. But they don't really know what these preachers and pastors are talking about, because they say that's not real. Well, the problem is it isn't in the physical world. It is real, but it's in the psyche of man and the collective unconscious, the unconscious and the collective unconscious of mankind. And there it's very real. And in those ancient days, obviously they didn't know anything about the collective unconscious, but they simply knew that the consequences of certain things would have results. And so Job, for example, and this is Jung's answer to Job, we're talking about it here. Job, for example, had all sorts of stuff rain down upon him, and he lost his children, he lost his flocks, he lost everything. And yet he maintained his belief in God. That's the story. And he never lost his faith. And the point is that, stuff happens. I mean, there are traumas everywhere. And, we have to reinvent ourselves multiple times in our lives, probably. The dean of students at my college used to say that a liberal arts education trains you for nothing, but prepares you for everything. And the point is that you're not stovepiped into only knowing AI, but not understanding what might be happening in the psychology of your fellow men. You want to know, everything about how a computer or an AI works, but you don't know anything about what the guy next to you is thinking.
Right.
That's a very limited person. But if you get yourself a liberal arts education and know many other things, then if you run into a roadblock, and I've run into quite a few in my lifetime, you know that that's not the end, that you can keep going, and that things will become better for you in the future. So,
that becomes just an opportunity for creativity.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I think many people who are probably listening to this video right now would love to have gone to the Monterey aquarium with me and Tim, and they would love to have gone with Tim to the Rodin sculpture garden, which we talked about at the beginning. Those are cherries. They're ripe grapes in the vineyard of life. That you hope to experience in your lifetime. That's what our confluence will be. It's a ripe grape that is, in a way, it's it is a psychotherapy, because it will bring everybody who attends will be brought closer to the healing power of the unconscious during that 4-day period. That inevitably will happen. And
well, that I think that concept of, the liberal arts degree, liberal arts education, again, the power of that, not necessarily to make money in a profession with liberal arts, it's to activate the psyche, just like the purpose of art and metaphor and symbol.
Precisely.
And that activating the psyche then activates your self-nourishing qualities, so that even when alone, cast out or by choice, you don't fall apart, because you are literally self-contained. And to me, the experiential training to me there is to put someone in Tornado Alley, basically, to experience that kind of weather where there's a certain intense, immediate, instantaneous pressure drop. It's the weirdest thing to not have the world holding you together. And when in a depressurized environment, you find out who you are. Well, do you fall apart? Do you panic? Or you go, oh, this is different? Like your mom. Oh, we haven't tried this yet. That's, and it's the kind of thing where then you see what's really holding yourself together. And if it's a bunch of temporary shoring for superficial imitations that you've done following other people, you're not going to last very long. And I think these times throughout history are that kind of depressurization. I mean, who let the dogs out kind of thing. The gate opens up and, well, is it over full? Is it under full? Is it dry? Is it going to be a flood? And I think that's what's so, I think, tricky about the strategy. And I really appreciate, I find it actually rather brilliant, how mature and quote unquote on the surface quiet the U.S. has been, and played not the, well, you threw a rock, so I'm going to throw a rock. We're not imitating. We have an identity being shown to I don't know if the word is parry or to engage, but it's, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me kind of thing. And we're not responding to the rhetoric, and we're responding to the actual events.
Yeah. And, people used to say to me in the military, remember that Russia is, or the Soviet Union was a lot of different countries pulled together. And so the Soviet army at that time had the same problems that Putin has now, maybe more so, because who would have fought effectively and driven those tanks into Madrid if they were from Ukraine or Belarus or Georgia or Chechnya? It's a real question whether they would have obeyed the Soviet power. But now all of those people know that they don't want what Putin wants. And they're talking about the corruption of the military, how these oligarchs have built themselves 500-foot yachts, but oh, by the way, they never spent the money to upgrade their tanks and that sort of thing. Well, that's going to make a big difference, because we have been upgrading our military right along, and they haven't, and with equipment. So the equipment we provide, like javelins, like stingers, is incredibly powerful. And, that's actually what happened. That's why Russia had to get out of Afghanistan, but then we didn't pay attention to our own lesson, and, we've been a little slow on the uptake also, because we keep trying to change people into little Americas, which has been happening because of the internet anyway for the last 30 years. But, we keep trying to impose upon other countries our style of living, and that's not on. And we've made that same mistake in Vietnam and Iran, in Iraq, and it seems we're not trying to make that mistake again. But in Afghanistan we did also. And so it seems that the government of the United States, regardless of political party, is wise enough to know that, we can't now save Ukraine and expect that they're going to become little Americans. That's not what's appropriate. And, obviously in all those cases, the people who lived in the place drove the big bears of the United States and Russia out. The Iraqis have their country. The Vietnamese have their country. Afghanistan has their country. And, they are at they're at a different stage of consciousness that we are at. And so we can't give them that stage. They simply have to experience the awful things that they're experiencing in order for them to get to the point where they see. And, the Vietnamese did that, to their credit. It's hard to watch, but we can't fix everything in the world. It has to fix itself through maturity and experience. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think the subtle piece that's in here, men still knew what they were talking about. People still knew what they were talking about when they said, fear God. It was only to be expected that man's slight superiority should have remained unconscious. Because what's interesting here is the whole Elohim, in Hebrew, it's really actually, Elohim is plural. And when you say God, it sounds singular, but the reality is there's a plurality inherent within it. And so that's, I think, the conscious unconscious piece, that even just the word Elohim, well, that's plural. So it's very much, at the very least, two, a couple, inner, outer, even. But the fact that the singular, capital G-O-D, remained, well, the thing is, the fear piece took several hundred years. So the process from beginning to now was forgotten. And this paragraph says it really clearly, that, that undermined the authority of a lot of the pagan religions, because the mythological deities started taking hits for, their bad behavior, so to speak. Whereas you didn't do that with a larger single one that was many inside. Right. So the conquest piece is expected, but at the same time, there's an inner conquest, I think, that's implied here, where, it was precisely the details of their mythological biography that had become their nemesis. So in a sense, you saying, like, when an argument starts and every other argument that's happened before comes into play, well, that's going to be up to no good. The past becomes a nemesis. So there's an ownership of understanding where you are now, which then goes to the next part of that sentence. With his growing capacity for judgment, man had found these stories more and more incomprehensible and indecent. So in that sense, that becomes the superiority piece. But rather than a condescending superiority, I find there's another step there that can become understanding, I'll be different like everyone else. There's a dignity in the difference. Instead of making little Americas all over the place, it's, no, what's your culture? Let's support your culture. And I think that's something that's often missed.
The culture applies down to every family even. And how we raise our children and our grandchildren in such a way that they comprehend these ideas, because Jung talked about the fact that you meet on the street people with consciousness that ranges from Neanderthals to us today, to human, educated human beings today. And so if you have a Neanderthal brain, then you're going to react as a Neanderthal. And we have to hope that we have enough people with enough consciousness to know what has to be done. And so you see the Congress just voted at $14 billion worth of aid to Ukraine, with both sides voting in favor of it, right? Because everybody knows that we have to fight back on this, and there's enough history that's 20th century history, so in the last century, that tells us that we have to respond to this, and we are doing. And I'm not going to publicly describe my own surmise on this, but what I can say, offer as my sincere appreciation for the fact that Biden isn't jumping in with both feet. And you hear some of the Republican senators wanting to jump in with both feet, and that's, I say, how are things from the cheap seats, guys? You're taking advantage of the unconsciousness of some Americans, or trying to, but we have to hold our water, and things are happening a lot more quickly than they happened through the Cold War. I mean, to the extent that Russia or the Soviet Union collapsed for financial reasons. That's the main reason it collapsed, not because we got into a hot war with Russia. The same thing is going to happen here.
Your point with the equipment is well placed. With it's kind of like, do you make your bed every day, or do you just close the door?
Yeah.
What is your inner state? What's the state of that? Well, continually upgrading the equipment, even if we're slow on the uptake, to me, it reminds me what most Norwegian parents tell their kids, and it's probably just to get them out of the house. But it's, there's no bad weather, just bad wardrobe. Arrive in the Arctic in your swimsuit and you die. So
yeah.
It's the kind of thing where America is taking its time to put on its coat, whereas little Trumpy would run out barefoot in a diaper and then wonder why he lost his toes and his fingers to frostbite, and then cry about it.
Yeah.
Instead of, well, put on your socks, put on your gloves, put on your shoes, put on your coat. So there's a whole preparation piece where I think the quote of, I'd rather be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war. And one thing about that too is, in a garden, it's typically quiet. So you will hear it coming. Right. And so you can take time to walk out of the garden, go back inside, put on your coat, pick up the sword, and then sooner or later you'll pick up the hoe and the shovel and go back to gardening. You hope, or you'll be put under. So
okay, let's get the next paragraph in.
Just a moment.
Yeah, go
just
ahead.
A minute.
Joel. Go,
I
Joel.
think that good morning, everybody. I think we should try to understand the archetypes of the nations.
Okay.
And I think that's what you were talking about a few minutes ago. And I think that I can perceive that there is a difference between the Russian people and Putin government. And I think that are two different things. I don't think that the Russian people like the war, like to kill other people. But maybe I think also that somehow we are dealing with a 19th century war in the 21st century,
Right.
because of the Crimean War. And the processes that goes on, the collective unconscious, take centuries to go on, to proceed.
Sure. The Crimean War was in the 1850s. And we have the famous, I think it's Rudyard Kipling's poem, Charge of the Light Brigade.
After the Napoleon Wars.
Yeah. And so, this time through, after this is over, then Russian people may be more educated about what actually has been happening. And all of us will be more educated. I mean, one thing that is very clearly missing in education is that historians have not gone back and considered the psychological events that caused wars. I mean, I majored in history in college, and all of my history courses were just, on such and such a date, this happened. And they would talk a little bit about the political stuff that was going on, but they wouldn't get into the deep psychology of it.
Right.
But now I think it's clear that we need people to come out of university with PhDs who understand the psychology of every historical event. And whereas,
right,
and so whereas, it might have been, everybody might think, well, everything has been written about the French Revolution, so I'm not going to do a PhD thesis about that. Well, no, that's not true at all. We don't have historical psychological PhDs that talk about what was happening in the collective unconscious and what were the causes and conditions of the French Revolution. We know a little bit, but nothing like the depth that we need. Nothing like the depth psychology that needs to be applied to it. And that's clearly a huge lack that has to be corrected in the 21st century. There's a whole nother area that I'm working on, which relates to art and what's sacred, but I can't really go into that now because we're just evolving that. But
well, quickly before we get to the next paragraph, I think I appreciate Joel bringing up the concept of let's look at the archetypes of the countries.
Yeah.
And I think in that context, I think it's fair to say, don't blame a people for the actions of its leaders. So
Right.
If you get past the us and them, when you see the Russian people and their revolts, however small or large they are, depending on the truth or consequences of the news or television, whether it's lies, fake, or real, staged or actual. I think the idea of the notion of the archetype of the nations, what is the archetype of the U.S.? What is the archetype of Ukraine? What is the archetype of Russia? and what props that up. And the thing is, the archetype there, what's the superficial shell of the appearance of the archetype, and what's the reality of the archetype? Because it feels there's going to be an archetypal pairing where you shift focus and redirect scale of what's within a particular archetype that's driving the archetype, because none of them ever stand alone. The unconscious doesn't work that way.
Yeah, well, very obviously, Putin fits within the patriarchy, right? The patriarchy archetype. And the opposite of that is perhaps a more reflective and better educated, more mature something. I don't know how to define that yet, but let me just cover a couple of points. At the end of World War I, Woodrow Wilson and the leaders at that time thought it was a good idea to be extremely punitive on the German people. But the problem is when the countries lay down their arms, when war is no longer viable on both sides, and so you stop fighting. The problem with that is that a lot of people would say, it wasn't my fault. Why are you punishing me? Okay, and so Hitler used that. They made the Treaty of Versailles punitive on the German people, and so Germans then, after the war, the next 20 years, struggled very much. And so it was fresh meat for Hitler to come in and say, you know, the Diktat of Versailles, and he would hammer on that point, you know, we got this crammed to us, we don't deserve this, right? And so we're going to come back and do the same thing to them. That's a patriarchal approach. But the United States at the end of World War II had the vision to introduce the Marshall Plan. And the result of that was, rather than being punitive on the German and Japanese people, we helped them grow and come into a new age. And probably a lot of knuckleheads were killed off during the war too. That helps. but we recognize that the new people coming along are the average people themselves, the Japanese people, the German people. They didn't want war any more than any of the rest of us do. But if you're punitive to them, then you're going to cause a reaction which requires payback. And so after World War II, we rebuilt Germany, we rebuilt Japan, so that they became the strongest allies of America. By the late 50s and early 60s, Japan and Germany were the strongest allies of the United States. And
the Marshall Plan.
Yeah, Marshall Plan, right, made that possible. And so it's just a different perspective on how you deal with it. And so at the end of this, whatever the end of this will be, we can't be punitive on the Russians. We have to get their population educated. That would be a good idea, right? And so the more exchange students from Russia that we bring into educational programs in the United States, the better, because they will see that there's something that they need, right?
And Joel made a great comment in the chat,
right,
I think, to that, where Putin is acting out. I mean, like a tantrum, like a childish tantrum. What's interesting, though, is anyone who has been trained in any kind of physical, whether it's pugilism, boxing, martial arts, military, etc., sports, there's an old adage of, don't show your teeth unless you're going to bite, which means, you can, and the counterpart of that, oh yeah, you talk a good game, but can you box? And so we see Trump who would just talk, me, and whiny and blamey. And well, Putin never showed his teeth until he was going to bite. And that's the thing, is it's in a sense the poker face. So there was a wisdom piece where Trump would have been, taken out at the knees on a football field. He would have been hit high and low and spun through the air until he came crashing to the floor. Yeah. It would have been quick and easy. And then, you change the force the other way. The other team gets the ball, so to speak. But Putin didn't do that. He came out with action. And so I think that's the thing where we did too, but the action was to take time to put on our coat.
Right. And so we need to wrap this up because I have a gym appointment in 20 minutes. But let me just say that I'll just read one comment from Justin, which is, please remember that the West isn't the world. Two of the nuclear powers, India and Pakistan, together have more than half the world population, and China likewise doesn't disagree with Russia and Putin. Right. The authoritarians don't disagree with Putin. Okay. And so I think what we've shown in this session that we've been having here, and thanks to Jordan and Joel for helping with it, is that this book isn't about something that happened in the 1950s. Okay. This book is the culmination, Answer to Job is the culmination of decades of Dr. Jung's study and trying to bring into context many, many things in Western consciousness, let's say. And it's every bit as applicable today to what's happening in Ukraine today as it ever was in the last 70 years. Mm-hmm. And so I urge, this book has been translated into most of the world's major religions or languages, including Portuguese, right? Joel, you have a Portuguese version of it, correct?
Yes, and I told you, this is Liberating the Heart on Portuguese.
Great.
I found on my library, and I said to myself, I will show to Steve.
Oh, that's wonderful to know, because you can't get that book in English anymore, but you can get it in Portuguese. Terrific. That's one of my favorite books.
Well, you made a comment, I think, as we're wrapping up, that Joel mentioned in the chat. He mentioned that Putin is acting out, but then you had indicated earlier, Putin's, in a sense, while he's acting out, he's unconscious of himself in that way. Right. And he may be very aware, deliberate of all these things, but that's the thing about actions when someone's acting out, is that once they start the thing moving, well, then you're right in the momentum of it. And you may be aware, but it's flashing by pretty fast, and you've kind of set something in motion that's hard to stop. Yeah,
and he's created a thing that he can't possibly stop by himself now. And so thinking that he's going to somehow negotiate and now keep these little parts of Ukraine that he claims want to be Russian, that settlement can't be anymore. Mm-hmm. And so more power to the Ukrainian people for holding this back, because they're holding it back will change the world in a very fast way. It won't seem fast because these days and months are dragging on right now, but ultimately, from a historical perspective, the consciousness that's being raised right now is coming very fast, I think. And people all over the world are seeing things. For example, a month ago, people didn't know that Putin was pure evil. Okay, but when you look at this, you can't deny Jung's dictum that, God has an evil side. And because God resides in us and all of us have an evil side, we have to be mature enough to recognize that somebody like Putin can't be allowed to continue in the human species.
And I think that's a wonderful point too, that I think Zelensky reinforced when he said, we don't need a ride. We need ammunition. We don't need a ride. He may have said it in reverse order. We don't need a ride. We need ammunition. Meaning, okay, the teeth have been shown. We saw them. We're not running.
Right.
And that's, two enter, one leaves. I don't think so. I think there's a strength and a power that's slowly being reinforced. That's necessary to then counter that evil, because right. And then the evil piece is also, it could be just the rotten on the top,
Right. So Justin has made a few comments about world affairs, which I'm not going to address today because they're not really on the points that we've been discussing. And but obviously there are valid questions about stupid things that the United States does as well. Okay. Mm-hmm. And especially some of those came up during the last administration. And we can't discuss all those here. And I don't propose to turn this Sunday morning event into a political science discussion. I do want it to stick to the knitting, which is Carl Jung's work. But the point of this session, and perhaps other sessions as we go forward, is to show how much this book, Answer to Job, applies to us today. And it's becoming more and more relevant as we go forward.
And it's not just even the psychology of war, it's the psychology of unresolved trauma that
absolutely
creates conflict. And actually it magnetizes conflict because people don't know any better until you heal it. And then you can go, oh, I hear the storm. I'm just going to close my mouth and open my ears wide.
Yeah, as a middle level Russian apparatchik, Putin watched as the USSR collapsed. That was obviously very traumatic for him. And we're now seeing how that's playing out through his psyche to the cost of many in the world. And
wasn't he also an interrogator?
I don't remember.
He was at KGB, isn't it?
Yeah.
Putin.
Yeah, well, I've heard stories that say he wasn't actually in the KGB, that he failed the KGB academy. I don't know, but anyway, he gathered power. It's just like Trump gathered power, not because he was a great politician, but because he could bamboozle people and he knew how to run a circus. Right. And because he knew how to run a circus, he could become president of the United States. But eventually, you have to leave the circus tent and live your lives. And that's the point. And metaphorically, that's the point. Everybody loves a circus for a while, and for a time, somebody that's like Trump can bamboozle us, or a magician can bamboozle us. But when you come out of the casino in Las Vegas, where you've seen the magic act, you have to live your life in the real world. Right?
Yes.
Yeah, it's like if David Copperfield makes the Statue of Liberty disappear, but I'm in a boat about 1.5 miles on the other side. I'm like, it never went anywhere. It stayed right there.
Right,
You know, and
surely.
it's all a matter of the perspective that you basically garden, and that you fool people into seeing an appearance versus a reality.
Yeah. So before we knew Putin as the president of Russia, now we know him as an evil dictator who's, controlling his own people to the max, and he will never be forgiven, or it will never be forgiven or forgotten what he's done. And so right now he may look like a big soap bubble floating around, but somebody's going to punch a pin in that soap bubble and he'll collapse, and then we'll have to clean it up. But it
It's the
brings a
cartoon
lot
of the big bear called Russia, and then the little bear trap called Ukraine, and the bear's looking down. Now it's missing its foot, and it says, "Oh, I didn't think about that."
Yeah, right. All right. So thank you, gentlemen. I
Yeah,
have
you
to
got
move
it.
along. So take
Okay,
care,
Steve.
and thank you for being here, Joel, today.
Nice
We'll see-
to listen to
Yeah,
you. I
we,
like
we
very
will
much.
have the usual schedule of sessions this week, including tomorrow night. So see you
Okay.
all. Peace.
Sounds
Take
good.
care.
Be